Chapter 34. Baxter seldom had trouble sleeping, but tonight was the exception to the rule. He'd awoken on several occasions to complete silence in his darkened room at La Amethyst, only to roll over dog-tired and begin another bout of fitful sleep. His recurring dream kept taking him back to the same scenario. He dreamt he was back at Merrillmar House, which sat in complete darkness, with only moonlight shedding an eerie glow into its rooms and corridors. He'd found himself pacing anxiously from one to another, desperately searching for Pilgrim as he heard her softly sobbing. A feeling of dread was beginning to saturate him as her weeping increased. The desperation of her cries constricted his heart. His feet wouldn't move fast enough. He had to get to her. She needed him. He felt an adrenaline rush course through his body as suddenly her cry of distress for him rang out. Baxter sat bolt upright in bed. Pulling the covers back, he leapt through his door, ran across their apartment, and burst into Pilgrim's bedroom. Awoken by the bang of her door hitting the wall, she jumped from her bed, grabbing hold of him. "What? What is it?" He clung to her. "Thank God. Thank God." He was trembling. "Don't make me slap you. What the hell's wrong?" She was genuinely worried. Trying to gather his wits, he forced himself to calm down. "Since that time in the apartment, when you inadvertently exposed me to your abilities, they've continued influencing me. I haven't been the same since. Normally I manage, apart from the fact I know how you're feeling, wherever you happen to be, which frankly can be a pain in the arse. The real problem is like tonight, when I don't know if it's real or not," he said, exhausted. "What's real or not?" she demanded. "It was definitely a dream, but I sense it's prophetic." "What's prophetic?" she asked. "You're at the house, Merrillmar. You're crying, and I can't get to you. Someone must be there, because after you scream my name in terror. You know I don't do terror. Come on, let's get a drink," she said firmly. Together they sat and talked until he was sufficiently wearied and decided to go back to bed. Hugging him and watching him retreat back to his bedroom, she tried to fathom what it all meant. She wasn't so stupid as to take it at face value. He'd been the only one that she'd accidentally shared her abilities with. As soon as it had happened, she'd stopped herself. Since that time, the psychic bond they shared had increased. She'd felt him listening into her mind, just as she did to his. She trod back to her bed in a contemplative mood. There were two things she must consider, sooner rather than later. Firstly, how to mitigate any danger to him that his present enhanced awareness might draw him into, and secondly, whether she should deliberately expose him again to her abilities so he could protect himself. She'd never seriously entertained the idea before, as she feared what it might do to him. After all, he didn't possess a fraction of her capacity. Plus, how did she know she was capable of doing it safely, as the first time it had happened spontaneously? Lying on his bed, Baxter acknowledged his sense of Pilgrim's well-being had become more acute. He'd felt her alarm after returning to his room. He'd read her emotions as unsure, mixed, and then afraid. That was all he needed to know. Tomorrow, he'd take matters into his own hands. The following morning, Monica sat at her computer, aghast. As she watched the icon of Baxter's brown bear and her father's black dragon come together on her screen. At first she'd questioned the validity of the new tracking devices she was using. She logged on to monitor where everyone was that morning, initially not taking much notice of the two icons moving around London's streets. That was until, at 15 minutes to 10, when they'd both come from separate directions towards one another. Snatching up her bag, she'd flown out of the door, hailed a taxi on the pavement outside Parr and had ordered the driver to take her to Rocco's, where the two icons had merged. Baxter looked up at the canopied front of Rocco's, the famous Italian eatery in London. He considered every possible angle to keep himself from harm, but at this point he'd reached his limit, and there was no going back. Mr. Phelps, seated in his Whitehall office, hadn't shown even moderate surprise at receiving Baxter's call, asking him to meet. Phelps had agreed to a 1-hour armistice on neutral territory. As Rocco's doorman greeted Baxter, he immediately spotted his nemesis, sitting in a sumptuous booth to the left. The maitre d' strode over, escorting him to the table. Phelps stood, offering his hand, which Baxter chose to ignore. "Your manners could do with some work." Phelps raised his eyebrows and sat down, signalling for the wine waiter to come over. "A bottle of poulet fusé and 2 chilled glasses," Phelps ordered. "Not for me," Baxter declined. Addressing the waiter, Phelps said, "Pay no attention to him. He always sulks when he's hungry. Bring a selection of breads and pastries." He took in the strained look on Baxter's face, knowing nobody chose to be in his presence unless there was no other recourse. "Pilgrim's in trouble and you need my help," Phelps stated. "Good guess," Baxter ground out. "Give me some credit," Phelps said. Rocco's sumptuous restaurant was busy with the mid-morning clientele who delicately picked at calzones and sipped piping coffee, its rich aroma lacing the air. "I must say your spontaneity quite took my breath away, Mr. Baxter." If there had been anyone else, and I mean anyone, that could shed some light on this, we wouldn't be having this conversation, Baxter said. The wine arrived, and he again declined, as Phelps shook out his napkin, laying it across his lap and taking a large sip of wine. "It really is very good. You should try it." Taking in Baxter's troubled demeanour, he asked, "What seems to be the problem, exactly?" Baxter looked him straight in the eye. "Did you know someone tried to take Pilgrim's life?" he said. Phelps's jaw stiffened almost imperceptibly. "I wouldn't have considered that a rare occurrence, and one both you and she must be familiar with by now." His slight hesitation hinted it was unwelcome news. "This was different, covert. Of course I thought of you immediately, but—" "But what?" Phelps asked curiously. "It wasn't your style," Baxter stated unemotionally. "I'm touched you recognized my craftsmanship. It's true, I do like to add a little panache to my work. I don't mind telling you it's sorely lacking these days. No one seems to take any pride in the profession. All they want to do is kill the person and take off. It's not like the old days when there was a sense of the artistic, of meticulous planning. I don't mind telling you what was once a highly respected and niche vocation amongst a certain respected fraternity has now lapsed into something disappointingly generic. You should see some of the maniacal idiots out there." Phelps paused, seeing Baxter's deadpan expression. "So, you've come to pick my brains and try to ascertain who this someone is." "Precisely," Baxter said. "I hope you won't mind me making an observation, but you do rather seem to have walked willingly into the lion's den by coming here," Phelps said. "Phelps, I don't have either the time or the inclination to indulge in your mental foreplay. I need answers, and I need them now," Baxter said. The waiter approached their table, leaving a variety of artisan breads and pastries on the table. "I'll ignore your disrespectful familiarity, as you're clearly not yourself. I can't pretend that I'm not concerned in seeing you so out of sorts, this vulnerability, this carelessness for your own well-being, Phelps stated genuinely. We have an agreed armistice, or perhaps you have a new number one enemy, Baxter asked. Phelps gave a small chuckle. Mr. Baxter, my dear Mr. Baxter, you mustn't fret on that score. You will always be my number one, whilst you're alive. How comforting, Baxter said sarcastically. It simply pains me to see you in such a state. Now, let's get down to business, Phelps said. Baxter beckoned the waiter over. Bring me an espresso. Turning to Phelps, he asked, What I want to know is if anyone in your organisation has been ordered to go after Pilgrim using some kind of poison. Phelps took on a serious expression. Bringing his napkin to his lips, he dabbed, placing it carefully back on his lap. It was this predatory air of Phelps's that reminded Baxter to be particularly vigilant. Phelps placed his elbows on the table, locking his hands as he gave him a penetrating stare. As you're well aware, Miss Pilgrim is of inordinate interest to our organisation. However, to go after her, as you so quaintly put it, surely suggests the perpetrator is unaware of what she represents. Our organisation will be most aggrieved to learn of this, he said seriously as he leaned back. So you're saying the Titans haven't issued a kill order on her? Baxter wanted to be clear. Certainly not. The whole idea is preposterous. You're certain it was poison? Phelps asked. Baxter put down his coffee cup, dabbing his lips with his napkin. It acted aggressively. He stopped himself. He didn't want to give too much information away. The prospect of having to turn to Phelps for help was the most dangerous move he could have made. As crazy as it seemed, he knew Phelps would consider it a point of honour to speak the truth, appreciating the risk he'd taken in meeting him. Baxter couldn't tell if he was just exhausted because, worryingly, he seemed to be relaxing a little too easily. He listened to Phelps. Miss Pilgrim represents more to our organisation than you can imagine. I give nothing away in my summation that you're not already aware of. It would be tantamount to sedition in its most acute form for any one of our number to pursue such a deadly path. Baxter smiled broadly at Mr. Phelps. He hadn't wished to, neither had he been thinking of anything funny. It had happened, and the reciprocated smile that spread across Phelps's face was confirmation he'd been drugged. How did you... Baxter tried to sound authoritative, but he just sounded content and happy. It's a homemade concoction of mine called compliance. We have an armistice. You agreed, Baxter struggled. Yes, I did, didn't I? Not to harm you, for 1 hour. I really should have a word with myself. This kind of underhand treatment is intolerable. You're a bastard, Phelps. Baxter smiled, feeling thoroughly good and without anxiety. Tut, tut, we mustn't resort to calling one another names. No, I'm sticking to my part of the bargain. I did give you my word not to harm you for 1 hour, which is sacrosanct. Phelps checked his watch. However, I do feel justified in taking certain liberties. Such an opportunity is unlikely to come again, and I intend to take full advantage of it. Phelps placed his head to one side, observing Baxter. Would you be a dear and scratch your nose for me? He asked. Baxter smiled weakly, involuntarily lifting his hand, and began to scratch his nose. Excellent, Phelps said. Baxter deliberately knocked over his espresso cup, which clattered across the table. A waiter quickly sped over, cleaned up, and poured him another. After he was out of earshot, Phelps enlightened him. "You're mistaken. It's in your napkin. It's a mycelium compound, part of a particularly virulent and potent strain of the fungi family. Its properties are unique. You inhaled it through your nose and mouth. For the next hour, you'll happily perform any request I make, after which I'm afraid I cannot guarantee your safety." Phelps stopped himself as some inner struggle played out. The voice that came out after was cunning and dripping with malevolence. "That is, unless I can't help myself." Reining in his psychotic mind, he continued, somewhat embarrassed, "I apologize, Mr. Baxter. That was totally uncalled for." "What do you want?" Baxter smiled weakly. "I have everything I want, Mr. Baxter, but there is something I need." "I'm not telling you anything," Baxter laughed, his head momentarily lolling onto his elbow. Throwing his head back with supreme effort, he burst out laughing as the mycelium began to take effect. Phelps glanced around him, satisfied no one was taking any notice of two good friends sitting down for brunch and obviously enjoying one another's company. "Mr. Baxter, I'm going to ask questions and you're going to answer them truthfully. Now, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to answer your questions truthfully," Baxter answered wearily. He wanted to sleep. "You will stay awake for me," Phelps instructed. "I will stay awake," Baxter said. "Does Miss Pilgrim have any idea where you are right now?" Phelps asked. "No," Baxter replied. "Good." Baxter grinned, causing Phelps to ask surprised, "Can she sense your condition?" "Yes," Baxter answered. "Interesting. Well, she'll think you're enjoying yourself. Now to my first question. Why doesn't Pilgrim's DNA stay intact outside her body?" "I don't know," Baxter answered. "Pity. Question 2. Are there any others like Pilgrim?" Baxter paused. "Mr. Baxter?" Phelps clicked his fingers at him. "Are there any others like Pilgrim?" "No," Baxter answered. "What are her vulnerabilities?" "Drink." Baxter laughed, struggling to keep Hansford's name from his lips. "You're trying my patience, Mr. Baxter. How can we capture Miss Pilgrim alive?" "Impossible." "Think, Mr. Baxter, and answer the question." "I wouldn't recommend it." Mr. Phelps, an artist in interrogation, was making a consideration. "Every species has a weakness. What is Pilgrim's weakness?" "Everything," Baxter answered. "Everything? Explain." "All things, living and inert. She told me." "Yes?" Phelps leaned in. "To say, she's going to kill you if you don't let me go." Phelps stared into Baxter's eyes, knowing somehow Pilgrim could see him. "You'll have to get in line and wait your turn, Miss Pilgrim." "Mr. Baxter, shut out all thoughts from Miss Pilgrim." "I can't." Phelps instantly checked his watch. Beckoning the waiter over, he settled their bill. "Come, Mr. Baxter, our chariot awaits." Monica arrived just as her father and a chauffeur were helping Baxter into the back of a limousine. She followed them in her taxi at a distance to a smart address in London's Mayfair, where she watched Baxter stagger from the limousine through the front door. She was frantic, but knew she couldn't take on her father. This time he'd certainly kill her. She thought about what he might have planned and knew he'd want to take his time. That would mean setting a stage. She began panicking as she anxiously attempted to mentally outmaneuver her father. She asked the taxi driver to wait for her. Once inside, with the door closed behind them, Phelps encouraged Baxter. "Step forward." Baxter came to an abrupt halt. In the hallway, the upright figure of a man with a grotesque smile gazed unseeing through glass eyes. The man had obviously been under the hands of a skilled taxidermist. His bare feet, with painted toenails, were placed either side of a tall brass bucket in which stood a variety of walking canes and umbrellas. "Where are my manners?" Phelps said. "Mr. Baxter, may I introduce you to Mr. Thorpe, your predecessor? You'll recall me telling you about my old nemesis who was making himself useful. I neglected to mention he's now my umbrella stand. To be honest, I'm tiring of him. He suffered from a pastiche personality and was never very scintillating company when he was alive." Baxter couldn't help but laugh. The mycelium was doing its work and it permeated through every cell in his body. "Please, won't you come in?" Phelps asked. Phelps opened an inner door into a large room that ran from the front of the house to its back. Large mirrors in various ornate gilt frames lined the walls, and crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The room was devoid of furniture, except for a single finely upholstered armchair with an accompanying side table on which stood a cut-glass decanter and a single wine-glass. "I was going for La Galerie des Glaces, Versailles Hall of Mirrors." "Not quite the same thing," Phelps observed, disappointed. "Phelps," Baxter managed as he slumped down in the chair. "Yes? What is it?" Phelps asked solicitously. "Let me go," Baxter said. "Now you don't mean that. Tell me you want to stay," he instructed petulantly. "I want to stay," Baxter said. "I knew it." Phelps clapped his hands together, reaching down to pat the back of Baxter's hand. "I think a little music is in order." Standing and moving over to a record player, he pulled a record from its sleeve, taking care to wipe it with a velvet pad before placing it on the turntable. Lifting the arm, he gently placed the stylus onto the record. The sound of Dalida's Parole Parole filled the room. "Take off your jacket and tie, Henry." Baxter complied. "I hope you'll excuse my lack of formal etiquette by my using your first name, but we'll soon be much more than merely acquainted. Please help yourself to a glass of wine." Baxter was now slumped in his chair as his hand wavered to find the glass. "Here, let me help you." Phelps poured the wine into the glass, bringing it to his lips and forcing him to drink. Baxter resisted as best he could, allowing most of it to spill down the front of his shirt. Phelps lifted the glass from him, finishing it off and smashing it in the grate, whilst quickly checking his watch. "I have so little time. It's so unfair," he mumbled, annoyed. Baxter's head had fallen forward and his eyes were closing. "Wake up," Phelps commanded. Baxter raised his head up slowly as he watched Phelps expertly dance a Viennese waltz, with his right hand on his midsection and his left hand out, keeping perfect time to the music. After a few minutes, Phelps again checked his watch, suddenly darting over to him. This party's just getting started. I'll be back in a jiffy. Don't move, he instructed. Phelps left the room and could be heard further down the hall opening drawers and banging cupboard doors. "Baxter," a girl's voice hissed. Baxter opened his eyes and looked up to the fresh face of someone he'd known long before. Monica took his arm and slung it over her shoulder. "Stand up," she instructed. He stood up, with difficulty leaning heavily into her as she struggled under his weight. "Move, now," she begged. She grabbed the back of Baxter's trouser belt and dragged him hurriedly to the front door, taking rapid looks over her shoulder for any sign of her father. Phelps could still be heard, singing an accompaniment. Easing through the front door, she pulled it quietly behind her and lugged Baxter across the road. Pushing him into the waiting taxi, she climbed over him, lifting his legs inside before slamming the taxi door. "La Amethyst, as quickly as you can," she shouted. Their taxi sped out into traffic. Phelps arrived back in the room. He'd removed his shirt, revealing his many scars and the tattoo running across his upper back and shoulders. He was dressed in a floral apron. In his hands, he was carrying a tray with various sinister stainless steel implements on it. Placing the tray on the fire mantel, he teased, come out, wherever you are." When there was no reply, he shouted, "Henry, come here now." When there was still no response, he walked slowly to the front door, which stood slightly ajar. He uttered menacingly, "That's just rude."